Did you know nearly every natural community in Florida is shaped by fire? Today, we'll talk about how prescribed fires mimic Mother Nature and how this benefits not only the plants and animals, but you. This is the Water Matters Podcast.
You're listening to the Water Matters Podcast, brought to you by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. We answer your most popular questions about the work we do and services we offer, including new projects, springs protection, water conservation efforts, and more. Learn about the many ways we serve the community and protect your water resources.
Welcome to this episode of the Water Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Michele Sager, and today we're going to be talking about the importance of prescribed fires. I'm joined today by Felicia Nudo, a land manager for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. She's going to explain what these fires are and walk us through the process. And stick around until the end, and I'll share some other resources for more information on our prescribed fires. Thanks for joining us today, Felicia.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So the obvious first question is, what exactly is a prescribed fire?
So a prescribed fire is a fire that we are setting under planned conditions in our conservation lands, and we're doing that to benefit the plants and animals within those lands, but also the surrounding communities.
So if we're using the term prescribed, I've got to imagine we're setting these purposely, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So if you think of your doctor prescribing a medication to maintain your health, it's the same thing with prescribed fire. We're setting it under a certain parameter of conditions to help the forest.
Now, we have a lot of people who move here from places where these type of fires aren't as common. So this is probably a foreign concept to them. Can you explain why the Water Management District would conduct prescribed fires?
Sure. So Florida is the top state for receiving lightning strikes in the United States, and wildfires are a result of lightning strikes sometimes. And so historically, wildfires would have occurred naturally, and they would have burned across Florida's landscape until they were extinguished by rain or they reached a wetland area. But today we can't really do that because of the increased development. And so the years and years of fire suppression that has resulted from that has resulted in areas that are overgrown. So that's why we're using fire to mimic that natural process.
So it sounds that prescribed fires are really strongly linked to the ecosystem. So if I'm maybe moved here from an area with a completely different ecosystem, that may be why I haven't seen fires in the past being used as a tool, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Florida's ecosystems and the plants and animals within those systems are all maintained for fire.
So what are some of the specific benefits we see from prescribed fires?
So the main benefit that we're seeing from prescribed fire in terms of the benefits for plant and animals is that opportunity for regrowth. The fire is resetting nutrients into the soil, which allows the plants to regrow. And additionally, it allows for wildlife to move more freely about. In addition to the benefits to plants and animals, we see a lot of benefits for people in the surrounding communities as well, because what we're doing is we're reducing that overgrown vegetation, which lessens the risk of wildfires.
Can you kind of explain the overgrown vegetation part? Because I think that's a little bit hard for people to sometimes understand.
Sure. So if you think about it like a garden, if you've ever maintained a garden, you know that it can become overgrown if you don't maintain it. And that's exactly what's happening in our ecosystems and in the forest. So the plants become overgrown, and that's just more fuel to burn. And so when we use prescribed fire in our burn units, we're reducing that fuel, which in turn lessens the risk of wildfire.
And I have to imagine that also has to have some kind of effect on the animals. Can you talk about if there's benefits for them?
Sure. So the animals benefit mainly, as I mentioned, by being able to move about better. But also they're benefiting because all of the plants are regrowing. The plants provide food and shelter to many different animals, but mainly insects. And so those insects and the plants are the base of the food chain. So it's all a cascading effect. So you get the benefit from the fire with the regrowth of the vegetation, but then that just affects the larger wildlife as well.
Now, when we see fires, especially after the fact, you see all this, blackened area. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, a fire, we're pushing out the animals, they're losing their homes. But that's not really the case, correct?
That's correct. So they're all adapted to fire. And, even though that they're pushed out temporarily, the long-term benefits are there to outweigh that temporary inconvenience to them.
Speaking of those long-term benefits, how do these prescribed fires benefit our water resources?
That's a really good question. I think when people think of water quality, they're thinking of wetland areas. But when we apply fire to upland plant communities, we are cleaning out that overgrown vegetation. And how that helps is that plants absorb water through their roots. And so when you have a lot of plants in an overgrown system, that's absorbing a lot of water. So by reducing that, we are reducing water loss through that. Additionally, plants go through processes such as evaporation and transpiration. So by reducing that overgrown vegetation, we are reducing the evaporation loss through transpiration.
So you mentioned previously that Florida's really seen a population boom and there's a lot of urban areas. So I imagine you have to do special planning for when you're doing these prescribed burns, which may come up near the urban areas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And the term that we have for that is the wildland-urban interface. So that just describes where our conservation lands are adjacent to more urban areas. So we have a lot of remote conservation lands, but a lot of them are now becoming more urban with the increased development. And that just requires some extra planning and consideration on our part as land managers so that we meet our objectives of protecting the adjacent communities and mitigating the risk of wildfire, but also so we're meeting our objectives as well as burning the property.
Which we're actually possibly preventing a catastrophe, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So a lot of our properties that are adjacent to urban areas, they require a very special burn window. And what I mean by that is that there's just limited days that we can burn. So those areas tend to be overgrown versus other areas. And so it's important that we really work on that to protect the houses that are adjacent to those boundaries.
Absolutely. And I know that we hear from some of the residents on our social media channels who've come from other parts of the country, and they do really appreciate that because some of them have seen devastation in other communities. And so it's great that we have this program to really help protect our residents.
That's right.
So let's talk about the process now, because I know that you don't just go out in one day and decide to set a fire. So talk to me about all the planning that goes into putting together one of these prescribed fires.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we don't just decide randomly one day that we're going to burn, this specific unit. It takes a lot of planning. So first we have to decide what's in rotation and what's out of rotation. And what I mean by that is just simply, what needs to be burned. And then we make a plan based on that. So we have to look at the weather and what parameters we need to burn that specific unit. We also have to do the coordination. Let's say if we're burning next to a highway, we have to coordinate with highway patrol. We would need to coordinate with homeowners that are adjacent. So all those things are taken into consideration. And then additionally, we're making maps of the unit. We're putting the roads on there that are within the unit, and we're also coordinating personnel resources as well, such as heavy equipment and then just the staff that we need for our burn.
You mentioned weather. Let's talk about that a little bit, because it's not just, it's raining today, we're not going to set a fire. There's a lot of factors you look at when you set one of these fires, correct?
That's right. And it's not just the weather the day of the burn. It's the weather in the months leading to the burn. We can't necessarily burn if we're in a drought. If conditions are unsafe, that would lead to hazardous conditions for the burn. But we're also looking at whether, the days preceding the burn. Because if we need, let's say, a north wind to keep smoke off of houses, we can't have south winds the next day because it's going to blow the smoke right on the houses. So it's a process.
And I imagine you're looking at other things like humidity level.
Yeah. So we look at humidity, we're looking at temperature, we're looking at drought indexes. We're looking at, the height of the mixing layer in the atmosphere for smoke management. So it's not just, wind direction and wind speed.
So a lot of science really goes into, putting together one of these events, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about you've done the planning. We're now going to set a fire. Take me through that day. What is that like? Because I know it's not just one person out there setting a fire, correct?
That's right. It's a team effort. So even though, we have the burn boss, which is the person in charge of the burn, we have the whole team to manage as well. So the day of the burn, we have to get our authorization from the Florida Forest Service, but we also have to make sure that the weather conditions are right that were forecasted. So, the day before the burn, we see the weather, we have to double check that the day of because things could have changed. So once we kind of get, our staff in order and all of that and our authorization, we head out to the site and then we conduct what's called a briefing. And it's just a meeting where we go over the details of the burn and how we would like to do our firing tactics, where resources will be placed. And that's also the time where staff can ask questions if they're unsure about anything. So once we kind of have the plan established, we see the weather's right, then we go ahead and we light something called a test fire. And what that does is it shows us what our weather conditions are. So even though we might have forecasted weather conditions, site weather conditions can vary. So that test fire shows us how our fire is going to behave. So if we're satisfied with that, then we'll go ahead and move forward with burning the entire unit. And then after ignition is complete, we'll start what's called mop-up. And what that means is that we will extinguish anything that's close to the boundary of the burn that might present issues with either containment or smoke management later on down the line that we're trying to mitigate.
Do you return to the site, the following day or days after?
Absolutely. So that really all depends on the weather. So if it rains the night of the burn, it's not necessary that we go out first thing the next day to check. But if it doesn't rain, we're absolutely out there checking, making sure that everything's still in the lines or seeing if there's anything that we need to mop up.
So we talked a little bit about what it's like for people who might see one of these fires near their communities. And I know it can be kind of scary to see plumes of smoke. So talk to me about what efforts are made to notify the public when one of these fires takes place.
So when we conduct a prescribed fire in a remote area, we'll get with the district's communication team the day of the burn, so that way we can put something out on our social media pages. When we have something that's more in the urban interface, we try to get those notifications out the day before. But as I mentioned, it's kind of hard to do that because we're kind of forecasting the future with the weather. So we try to get the notifications out as soon as we can, or as soon as we're sure that burn is going to happen.
And it's good for people to know that a lot of these fires are posted not just by our agency, but other agencies on social media sites such as X or on Nextdoor. So if you see a fire in your area and you think it is, the easiest thing to do is go to our one of our social media channels because we'll likely have that posted. And it really answers that question right away for people, what's happening in my area. And then they don't have to worry as much.
Yeah, and also the Florida Forest Service has a map on their website where they post point locations of all the burns that are going on, and they do a pretty good job on their Facebook as well.
Absolutely. How many prescribed fires do we conduct each year?
That's a tough question. I could better answer it with acreage. So the district has over 160,000 acres of burnable acres. And so what we do is our goal is to burn about 40,500 of those acres each year. So it can vary because the burns, like each burn unit is a different size. So it's just hard to say how many burns we do each year.
And this past year, do you have any idea about how many acres that you burned?
Yeah, so approximately in 2023, we burned 39,500 acres, which was pretty impressive given the weather that we had.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we had such a dry year, and so we just made sure to take advantage of anything that the weather gave us.
And I've got to imagine you see the benefits, after kind of looking back in a year and you're revisiting those properties, you start to see the ecological benefits of, conducting all of these fires.
Absolutely. At Starkey, we burned and, we saw plants in there that just didn't have room to grow. And so there was a specific species of milkweed that we noticed there was, maybe about 50 of those plants in one unit just blooming. So that was great to see.
Well, that's great. When we talk about all of these, all of these acres that we burned, I think it's important to kind of explain to people the difference between a prescribed fire and a wildfire, because we do get those sometimes. And we've seen in the past where wildfires have been minimized because of our prescribed fires. Can you talk about the difference and how they relate?
So the main difference between prescribed fires and wildfires is that prescribed fires are planned and wildfires are unplanned. And when we're planning these prescribed fires, we're looking for a certain set of conditions and we're looking to meet specific objectives. And these are things that we've already talked about, like the hazardous fuel reduction and also the habitat improvements for wildlife.
So really, it comes down to planning. It's all about planning.
Absolutely. Yes, a lot of planning is involved.
Well, this has been such great information, Felicia. I really appreciate you being here today. You've definitely educated us all on prescribed fire, and hopefully people will have a better understanding of them when they might see or smell them in the community. You can get more information and check out some of these fires by visiting our Good Fire playlist on our YouTube channel, Water Matters TV. And thank you again for listening to the Water Matters podcast.